To all who come to this happy podcast, welcome. Welcome to This Happy Place, a Disney podcast. And in this episode, we are continuing our series of talking about every movie to come from the Walt Disney Animation Studio. We are on number 12, which is the first film in the Silver Age. If you want to know more about the ages or eras of Disney animation, I do have an episode about that. But Cinderella is the first movie in the unofficial Silver Age of Disney animation. This also means that we are done with the wartime or packaged era films, and I am really happy that we are done with those. Don't get me wrong, I did like some elements of them, some shorts that made up those films were really great, but after a while, I'm not going to lie, they did get tiring just watching a short after short and not watching a cohesive story or a one singular narrative. But now we're on Cinderella, and that means that we do have a full-length feature film to talk about that is one cohesive story. But Cinderella, like I mentioned, is the 12th movie to come from the studio. And before we get into talking about Cinderella specifically, I feel like it would be really important for us to almost have a retrospective, if you will, set the stage for where the company was at this moment in time and what they were experiencing. So Cinderella was the 12th movie to come from the studio, and Snow White, as we all know, was the first. Not only was Snow White the first movie, but it's also Disney's only massive moneymaker. The 10 films in between Snow White and Cinderella were extremely detrimental. They affected the studio, in most of them in a very negative way. Pinocchio, Fantasia, and Bambi were all movies that were expensive and didn't make their budget back, losing the studio money. Dumbo was made on a more conservative budget, so it made money, but it just enough to keep the studio afloat. Then World War II happened, and that brought its own set of challenges that directly affected Disney. In a way, the war saved Disney, however, since Disney contracted with the U.S. government to make films as part of what they called the Good Neighbors program. Those films were Saludos Amigos and The Three Caballeros. That war ended before the contract was fulfilled, so Disney didn't have that money coming from the government anymore. They made other packaged films like Make Mine Music, Fun and Fancy Free, and Melody Time. These films made just enough money to keep the studio afloat, but if you only make movies that just barely keep you going, you are going to sink eventually. Disney was at their sinking point. Their next film was going to be debatably the most crucial film for the studio since Snow White. You can travel to the earliest idea of making a Cinderella movie all the way back in the 1920s when Walt was working at his first animation company, Laugh-O-Gram Studios. There he actually worked in part and made a Cinderella short film. There's also a history of storyboards and scripts being created for a Cinderella adaptation dating back to the late 1930s, and I bet we would have gotten a Cinderella movie sooner if it wasn't for the war. Walt, knowing how crucial Cinderella was for the existence of the studio, didn't want to take any chances with anything. He did some things that he usually wouldn't do. One of those things is to hire out the people to write the songs for the movie. Typically, the mantra for writing songs for a picture at Disney was write a song for the story, and if it becomes a great hit or a big hit, that is great. But don't write it initially as a commercial hit. This did work out for them, as evident by When You Wish Upon a Star from Pinocchio and Someday My Prince Will Come from Snow White. But Walt didn't want the risk of a song not connecting with the audience. So he hired outside songwriters from Tin Pan Alley. Tin Pan Alley refers to a group of music publishers and songwriters based in New York City, primarily during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, who dominated American popular music. Walt heard one song and went after the trio who wrote that song. The trio consisted of Al Hoffman, Mac David, and Jerry Livingston. The first song they wrote for Cinderella was "A Dream is a Wish Your Heart Makes," and the first time that Walt heard that song, he knew that he made the right decision hiring these commercial songwriters. Cinderella also is actually the first time Disney had distributed music through their own publishing company. They felt that the music in Cinderella was going to be a big hit, so they wanted to do the publishing themselves so they could reap all the benefits from it, and that definitely was the right choice. The voice of Cinderella is one of Eileen Wood. The three songwriters actually needed a voice to help present their songs to Walt. Through Tin Pan Alley, they knew Eileen and invited her to come be a test singer, for lack of a better term. But Walt loved her voice so much, he decided to cast her as the leading role. The animation of this movie only took about 6 months to complete. It was a relatively very quick process. That is because there was some serious prep work that happened before the animation even started. In a way, you can say that the 2015 Cinderella is not actually the first live-action Cinderella that Disney had made. Before animation started on the Cinderella classic, they acted out pretty much every scene in live action. They built small sets, they had actors do lines and dance, and somewhere out there we have a live-action Cinderella. Now this is pretty typical for the animation process, having live-action actors be a point of reference for the animators, but this was different. This was never meant to be released. It just used as a guide for the animators, but a different type of guide. What they would do is they would take the film from its live-action version, blow it up to the size of an animation pane, and they would trace over it. Animators weren't too happy about this, as they felt like it was unimaginative, and well as not liking the feeling of just mindlessly tracing things. Not everything you see is traced, however. Sometimes they did take liberties, but one animator didn't like it at all, and that animator was named Ward Kimball. Ward Kimball is the one that animated Lucifer the cat and all the mice. So he was actually very happy that he had the most free range of the animators on Cinderella. You can't really get mice and cats to do the things that they do in the movie on a live-action set. Ward's specialty in all of animation was wild, crazy, and enthusiastic characters. Ward Kimball was actually one of Disney's 9 old men. The 9 old men, who weren't really that old, were a group of core animators at Disney who helped set the style, personality, and storytelling at the studio, starting from the 1930s and some of them even going into the 1970s. But I feel they really didn't hit their prime, they didn't hit their stride until 1950 Cinderella. Each of these 9 old men had their specialty, something they were known for. One of my favorite things to do is study the 9 old men and then watch these classics. And then when I watch these classics, I can start to tell who did what. And that is so fun to be able to get to know these classic Disney animators on that type of level. Eric Larson was known as being the mentor of the group, as well as being a grandpa-like figure, being sincere, genuine, and heartfelt in everything that he does. Mark Davis was known for being able to create strong female characters, heroes or villains. Walt tasked Eric and Mark to help create Cinderella. Eric wanted Cinderella to lean more toward the gentle, quiet type, while Mark wanted Cinderella to have more of a sense of sophistication and intelligence. These two combined their ideas and gave us the character that so many of us have fallen in love with. Milt Kahl was probably the most technical skilled out of the 9 old men. One thing he did quite often was clean up work on other animators' work. Oftentimes, Walt would walk into Milt's office, and if he wasn't there, Walt would say, "Where is the genius?" Milt was one of the very few people who could go toe-to-toe with Walt, often challenging Walt's ideas. Milt was known for having great detail when it came to animating humans, especially their hands. Milt did the Duke, the King, and the Godmother for Cinderella, And next time you watch this movie, pay close attention to their hands and you will see Milt's exceptional work. Frank Thomas was known for injecting very prominent personalities into each of his characters. Some key scenes he is known for is he animated the dwarfs crying over Snow White and Bambi and Thumper learning how to skate. In Cinderella, he did Lady Tremaine, the first time that he has really done a villain. He was unsure why Walt asked him to do it, and he didn't think he could. But while Frank was working on Lady Tremaine, the other animators were amazed at how they could see his gears constantly turning. No matter the type of character, you could count on Frank to give them unforgettable personality. And that is one of my favorite things about Walt. Walt very often assigned people tasks that they previously didn't have any experience, but he saw that they were talented enough that they could make it work. One example of this is Bob Gurr designing the ride of the Matterhorn. Bob Gurr is a legendary Imagineer, and before designing the Matterhorn, he didn't have any experience with roller coasters, and Bob Gurr has said that he had to teach himself trigonometry in order to create the Matterhorn. But I could go on and on talking about Disney's 9 old men. I love reading about them. I love getting to know them. I love being able to tell which parts of each movie they did. Maybe a 9-episode series about each one of the 9 old men will be a good idea that I will be doing eventually. Cinderella was a success in every way that you look at it, financially, critically, and with the audience. It was the first real financial success since Snow White, and the best reviewed Disney film since Dumbo. But let's start talking about Cinderella and what I think of this movie. Let's start by talking about the character of Cinderella. One of my favorite movies in recent years is a movie called King Richard. It's one starring Will Smith, who plays the dad of the famous Williams sisters, known for their tennis dominance, so Serena and Venus Williams. But while those girls were young, at least this is how the movie depicted it. I can't say to what happened in real life. This is just what happened in that movie. But while the girls were young, their dad showed them this Cinderella and later asked them, "Why do you think I showed you this movie?" The reason he showed them that movie is he wanted to show them the character of Cinderella and how no matter how you are treated, you always have room to be nice and respectful. That is perhaps the biggest highlight of the Cinderella character and maybe perhaps the thing that she is the best known for. From the very beginning of the movie, you get a sense of who Cinderella is. The birds fly into her room, wake up with her chirping. There is this one red bird sitting next to another bird. That red bird then continues or starts to whistle, and the other bird puts her wing over his beak. This red bird then flies over to Cinderella to sing, and Cinderella expresses her appreciation for the birds singing. So, you can really get to know Cinderella in a really quick way and get to know that Cinderella actually is a very loving person. The song that is put in her, or the song that she sings is a perfect way to further elaborate on her character right at the beginning. And that is, of course, "A dream is a wish your heart makes." This song has almost become as synonymous. I don't know how to pronounce that, I guess, but you know what I mean, with Disney, as the Disney theme song "When You Wish Upon a Star" has become. We all know the opening line, which is of course the title to the song, but I don't feel like we have taken the proper amount to look at all the lyrics, really dissect them, and they really do kind of set the thesis or the opening sentence of what Cinderella is going to be about. Because, a dream is a wish your heart makes when you're fast asleep. But then my favorite line of this song is actually, no matter how your heart is grieving, if you keep on believing, the dream that you wish will come true. You think about this in terms of what Cinderella has actually experienced. She experienced the passing of her mom. She has been grieving the passing of her dad. and almost grieving life since the passing of her dad when Lady Tremaine started showing her true character, as well as the two stepsisters, Anastasia and Drizella. But this line, no matter how your heart is grieving, if you keep on believing, the dream that you wish will come true. Now, it's never 100% explicitly said what Cinderella is exactly dreaming for or what her dreams consist of, but you can definitely infer what she wants. And I think this is an exceptional example of that classic storytelling technique of let's show, don't tell. You can tell that she's just dreaming of having a better life. No matter how complex that better life is or how simple that better life is, you know that she wants it. And even with that line that she says, there is that one thing, they can't order me to stop dreaming. That comes, of course, in terms of at the beginning of the day, they are starting to order Cinderella around very quickly. And she just says, I can keep dreaming no matter what they put me through. And that dream that she has is really what moves Cinderella forward throughout this movie. And that is actually a brilliant metaphor for Walt Disney himself. I love Disney parks, so it's definitely a metaphor for what eventually happens with the Disney parks. Walt Disney had this dream, and no matter what he was told, he knew that he was going to achieve it, and he knew what Disneyland could one day become. And look what it is now. Perhaps there isn't another Disney movie that is more about dreaming than Cinderella is. I want to briefly return to, I just want to not return, but continue talking about Cinderella, the character herself. I'm definitely making my list of favorite Disney characters as I've been making this list through this series. And I think Cinderella is definitely one of Disney's most popular characters, and her influence is definitely all over the film. With that being said, it doesn't feel like Cinderella is in it all that much. Is she the character with the most screen time? Probably. Most likely. It just doesn't feel like that. I was actually surprised that I was thinking to myself that Cinderella really isn't in that much of Cinderella. She is the character with the most screen time for sure, I believe, like I just said, but it doesn't quite feel like that, and I don't really know why I feel like that. I think it comes from a place of me wanting to see more of her. I love her character, what she stands for, and I think throughout this movie, I would have loved to see how she handled more situations. But playing devil's advocate to my own point for a minute, I'm not even sure in how many situations you can really show her. I mean, how many different ways can you show the stepsisters and the Lady Tremaine being mean to her? This movie also spends a lot of time focusing on the mice characters, and I would say the two main leading mice are really Gus and Jack, or Jack and Gus, I think is how it actually is. These two, along with Lucifer the cat, are definitely the comedic relief of the movie. One of my favorite memories of this movie, as I look back of how I watched it, or when I watched it as a child, I loved how many different fun hiding places or holes in the walls that the mouse go in and out of. And I also don't know why, but as a kid, I found a scene really satisfying where Lucifer is like chasing the mice. I think this is when Gus and Jack are actually trying to retrieve beads to help make Cinderella's dress. But at this moment, they're like racing and they jump into a hole, like a square hole in the wall. Then Lucifer's snout goes right into that hole, comes out, and the snout turns into a square, just like the shape of the hole. I don't know what it is about that. That just made it really, as a kid, I just thought that was really funny and really satisfying. But there are two incredibly charming scenes between Gus, Jack, and Lucifer. The first one happens shortly after they actually rescue Gus from the mouse trap. And they are hungry little mice, and so they go down and they try to look for food. And out like in a courtyard type area, Cinderella is feeding chickens what looks like to be pieces of corn. I don't know what it actually is that, but that's what it looks like. But the mice notice that Lucifer is kind of just sitting right in the kind of servant kitchen where Cinderella prepares food, right in the middle. And so they can't really go past Lucifer to go outside because then they would get eaten. So what they do is, in kind of the mice equivalent of drawing the short stick, they all back up to make sure that their tails are kind of tangled up in each other. And then they pick one. Jack accidentally picks himself. And so he's the one that is acting as the sacrificial mouse to distract Lucifer so they can go get their food. He does so by kicking Lucifer's leg. So Lucifer kind of face plants into the milk that he was drinking. And then there's a big chase scene with Lucifer trying to get Gus or Jack while the other mice go and get food. But then Gus, obviously being the mice that he is and loving food, when he tries to return with the food, brings too much, he spills, and Lucifer chases him. And then do you know that game where you have like the cups and a ball underneath, and you have to try and guess what cup the ball is underneath? They kind of do that in this movie with Gus being the ball, hiding under a bunch of teacups, and Lucifer trying to figure out which one Gus is under. That is a great, charming scene that just makes you laugh. It is a really fun time. And there's another scene that I kind of alluded to before, a chase between all of them when they're trying to help retrieve beads for Cinderella's dress that they're making. The mice, they are in this movie a lot, and I do love every single time we see them, but are they almost too much of a distraction in this movie? Maybe a distraction is the wrong word for it. Maybe a better word to use is a diversion, I think would be a better word to use. The movie really is about Cinderella overcoming the situations she finds herself in by staying a good person and reaping the rewards. I feel like there are too many scenes, or the scenes we do have are slightly too long, and they take away from like the thesis or the message that this movie is trying to get across. I do have a solution for this, however, and this solution won't require taking any of the scenes out. In fact, all of the scenes are fun. They are done very well, but my solution is to simply make this movie longer. The movie comes in at just 1 hour and 18 minutes. It's a very short movie. Snow White was about 10 minutes longer. Pinocchio was 12 minutes longer. And I just felt like even adding 10 or 12 minutes somewhere in this movie would make it so the message of dreaming and doing good no matter the circumstances around you would be able to be more present in the movie, and it wouldn't feel as quickly paced. Because with this movie being short, there are some moments, our scene transitions from one moment to another, that kind of do feel rushed, that kind of do feel very quickly paced. The pacing was off, and I think the biggest example of this that I can give is at the end of the movie when Cinderella tries on the glass slipper, and then they all like celebrate like, hey, yay, we found the person who this glass slipper belongs to. But then it's immediately from that, immediately to wedding bells, immediately to Cinderella, Prince Charming, running down the steps. And I feel like if they could have had just one more brief moment of the slipper, or after Cinderella tried on the slipper, meeting Prince Charming before the wedding, would have really made that ending a little bit more enjoyable. Because you really do want to have a moment of appreciating the moment, if that makes sense. I want to take this very satisfying moment of Cinderella revenge, for lack of a better term, getting her revenge on Lady Tremaine and the two stepsisters, like, hey, I'm in this situation, you're not. And I really wanted a moment like that. And maybe this is just because I love the live action Cinderella. I've probably seen that movie a dozen or so more times than I've seen the animated version. And there are so many great little added things in that movie that really flush out the characters a lot more, the story. So maybe it's not entirely fair for me to judge the animated movie based on feelings and expectations I have from the live action movie. But I think even if there was no live action Cinderella, the pacing issues would definitely still be there. But I would be amiss if I didn't talk about Lady Tremaine in more detail. I think without question, she is by far the best Disney villain up to this point. Beating out the evil queen, beating out the couple of people that you could consider villains in Pinocchio. Same with Bambi, humans being the villains in that movie, and the villains in Dumbo. This really is, Lady Tremaine really is, I feel like, the best villain, the most cohesive villain, the villain we see the most of. Especially, think about the scene in the movie when one of the first times we see Lady Tremaine. We just see her in the dark, eyes open, very menacing, very stern voice, and you just can't help but hate her immediately. She is, like I said, up to this point, the best Disney villain, and we're about to go on a long streak of great classic Disney villains. Maybe not a long streak, but we have Peter Pan coming up, we have Sleeping Beauty coming up, and I just can't wait to talk about the villains in those two movies. Well, that is it for my thoughts on Cinderella. Cinderella is undoubtedly a bona fide Disney classic. I think when people think of Disney classics, one of the very first films they think of, even before Snow White, even before Dumbo or Bambi, is Cinderella. And maybe that's because her legacy is, I feel like, much more prominent than like Snow White is. Cinderella has her own castle in Disney World. Cinderella doesn't have her own dark ride, but I do feel like people grew up watching Cinderella more than they did watching Snow White. And I absolutely loved Cinderella. It is always fun to go back and see a bona fide Disney classic. And so in my ranking of Disney movies, this is one of the hardest decisions I've had to make. I didn't know where in my top 4 to place it, but I think right now I am going to place it in my number 3 spot. So it's going to go Dumbo, it's going to go Snow White, then Cinderella, and then Fun and Fancy Free. I think the main reason I'm putting it behind Snow White is I feel like the character, I love the dwarfs. It's very hard for me to pass up anything dwarf related. I'll prefer the dwarfs over the mice any day. Even though I like Lady Tremaine better, I feel like the old hag, the evil queen in Snow White is still a still perfectly suitable villain. And just knowing what it meant for Disney as a whole, Snow White is in my number 2 spot and Cinderella in my number 3 spot. Well, thank you again for listening to this episode of This Happy Place, a Disney podcast. And remember, there is a great big beautiful tomorrow shining at the end of every day.